Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to number 118 in the Learn with Lorna series. This week we're looking at the subject of oral histories. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. And the Highland Archive Service has 4 centres where we look after the historic documents of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. They are in Inverness, in Wick, in Portree and in Fort William. So hopefully by now you'll know all about our 4 centres and some of the things that we hold in them. This series, Learn with Lorna, is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you so much, those of you who have done so. It really does make a difference to us being able to carry on all the different work that we do. So welcome to this week's session where we're looking at a very specific type of archive, an oral history. I'm going to share some stories from the oral history collections that we have and the oral histories we have within our collections, and also talk about what oral history is, why it matters, and what we hope to do with that going forward. So what is an oral history? Well, the clue's really in the title. It is a history of something or someone that is given orally or verbally. And if you think about it, orally is the way that we have always passed things down and communicated over centuries and centuries and millennia. We have passed down information and knowledge through conversation. So even way back in the far distant past, the information about where there's danger or where there's safety, where food can be found, things like that would be passed on orally. Things such as recipes and traditions, we've learnt things from our grandparents who've learnt it from their grandparents, where they've told us something and it's been handed down either in a family or in a community or in a nation. And so some of those things are knowledge things, and some of them are stories, and there is absolutely a crossover between those. But stories of things like the sagas, stories of battles, stories of family traditions and things that have happened within your family, myths and legend, eyewitness accounts of events, are things that we have always passed down through speaking. And throughout history, from thousands of years BC, we've not only told that story verbally to each other and passed down that information, but then we've gone on to write down the information that's been given to us. And there are numerous examples of this, but perhaps for those in the UK anyway, the best known example from our perspective in the distant past would be the Venerable Bede, perhaps, who was a monk who lived in the north of England in the 600s and 700s. And Bede's writings form a huge body of information about life in England over the preceding centuries. And Bede used written sources to compile his writings, but also oral tradition. And he acknowledges that in his writing, that there are numerous people who have told him things that he's then included in his writings in the 600s and 700s, which we have then, of course, used to inform subsequent writing. And the Oral History Society, who I will come back to shortly, they also mention Samuel Johnson as having a real interest in oral tradition. Samuel Johnson, of course, compiling one of the very first dictionaries of the English language. And so we've gone naturally from passing stories down orally to also passing them down and writing them down. And then, of course, we move on to printing them. And all of this is happening while people are still orally passing down those stories. But as progress in technology changes, we start to write down those stories, then we start to print those stories. And then the next development that came in the story of oral history also came as a result of changing technology. This time it was the invention of the ability to record sound, and then the gradual improvements to the quality of that sound and the preservation of that sound through the late 1800s and early 1900s. So we start to not just rely on passing the information down where there's a risk that information is skewed or lost or bits are missed out or changed, but we also start to be able to capture that oral history at a point in time when a person said it. And as I say, we're looking at the late 1800s to early 1900s. And this meant that for the first time, it wasn't just the information or the knowledge or the story that could be passed down, but also the person's own voice. So a personal story given in the most intimate and individual of ways, where you can preserve that person's voice. And if any of you have lost somebody but have a recording of their voice, you'll know how emotive and powerful that can be to hear that person talking about things in their own voice. So now we've come through thousands of years, hundreds of years in the past, and we've come to a point where it becomes much easier to capture people's stories in their own voice and in their own words. So we're looking at maybe the mid 1900s for this. Mid 20th century is really where oral history as a sort of named subject really comes in. It obviously has been there for much, much longer, but it really starts to flourish as a discipline in the mid 1900s. So once all of this has come together and we can record people and we can preserve that sound of them telling their story, who did people choose to record? Well, it's a really interesting answer because a large number of the first recorded oral histories focused on working class people and folk lives. So there was a feeling that the great and the good were already represented in archives and other institutions. Those stories were already in existence. But there was an awareness that the majority of people just quietly getting on living everyday lives weren't represented, or certainly weren't represented as much. And we certainly find in our collections, you might find a snapshot of someone, you might find them represented in a poor relief record or an asylum record or something like that. But you won't necessarily get a broad view of their story. Even though in, of course, almost all history books and texts throughout written history, they will have contributed their stories. You know, Bede and other historians weren't present at everything. They're relying on people giving them eyewitness accounts and statements. So they are there in those stories, but they're not the focus of them very often. And so in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, this was a really important time for the promotion of oral history and the study of oral history, and the flourishing of collecting those stories. The School of Scottish Studies set up a programme for recording people, as did the Welsh Folk Museum in this time period, both focusing largely, or at least in part, on the stories of people who otherwise wouldn't be represented in archive collections. And then various other groups, projects and programmes were all springing up and being set up around this time. And particularly this coincided with the story of the labour movement in the 1960s and 70s. And it was in 1973 that the Oral History Society was established. And that is one of the main go-to, absolute reliable institutions for advice and guidance on this subject, a real body of knowledge there. There are others, and I'll come back to talk about them, but the Oral History Society, a very, very useful institution. Now, those ones that I've mentioned, the School of Scottish Studies, the Welsh Folk Museum and so on, and then the setup of the Oral History Society were followed by others that are equally important and useful, such as the Scottish Oral History Centre. Some of these institutions and bodies, some focus on a specific theme. So there might be a collection of oral histories of nurses, or there might be, there's a fantastic project that looks at people who have been in and around several specific prisons in Northern Ireland. And those are a fantastic collection as well. So some focus on a theme. Some might have the focus of a place. So it might be looking at gathering stories from Caithness, for example, and I'll come back to that in a second. And some have come about with a kind of broader overview to take in oral history collections generally to preserve them. And so that's kind of very, very briefly, and I'm sure I will have missed out lots of important dates and important organisations, but that's very briefly how we came to have an oral history focus in this country, through the recognition of the role that oral tradition had played in the past, and through those changes in technology that enabled us to capture people telling their own story in their own words. and then a sort of active turn to actively go out and gather people's stories to make sure that those people are represented, particularly where things are at risk of being lost. Now, those recordings that were made or continue to be made from the sort of 1950s onwards, and there will be some before that, but they were and are either kept by the bodies that captured them or added into an archive, and sometimes both. So, for instance, we have a number of oral history collections, which I'll come back to in a second, that we haven't recorded, that have been recorded by other bodies or institutions or individuals, but then have come to us for safekeeping. And then we also have collections that we have actively gone out and recorded. Now, there are always some things to consider when you're recording an interview in oral history or when you're listening to an oral history, as there are with any source. So oral histories are subjective. These are narrative sources. It's someone telling a story. And it's completely and utterly inevitable and unavoidable that those will be subjective, because it's one person telling their story of their experience and their viewpoint. So they may well contain things like such and such was unfair when it happened, or they might record things as absolute fact, whereas actually they're a perception of a fact or a feeling about something. And the other thing people do when they're telling their story, of course, is either forget parts of it or may never have known why something happened to them that had an knock-on effect. And they may also be very conscious of the fact that they're recording something for a legacy and therefore think about how they want to portray themselves. How do they want something to sound? And as I say, it's completely inevitable that this is the case, but also, and I think this sometimes gets overlooked a little bit, is not by people who work in and amongst oral histories, but just generally, I think we sometimes don't always realise that every single type of source is subject to the biases of the people who gave it, so the person who told that information, to the person who captured it. So if you have been the person recording the interview or taking down the information, and also the people who are listening to it, all of those, or reading it, all of those people come with their own biases. I mean, a great example of that is the census records, where people's names would be written down according to the way the person hearing it thought it should be written. So there's the bias of the person giving the information, the bias of the person taking the information, and then the bias of the person, however many hundreds of years later, absorbing the information. And I think it's just something we need to take into account when we're using primary sources of any kind. But it's perhaps more noticeable in an oral history because it is so personal. You're hearing that person telling the impact that something had on them, and therefore, of course, it's personal. And it's not a problem. It's just something to be aware of when you're using oral histories, to use them alongside other sources if you're trying to prove something factual. But if you're trying to just learn about that person's experience, then fantastic. And it's also something that we have to consider when we're taking an oral history, when we're recording with somebody, is how do we capture as full a story as possible without leading people, without directing the conversation much, and without agreeing or disagreeing with what that person's perception is of the story they're telling. Our role is simply to let the person speak. So let them tell their story about their life, their work, or whatever else it is that we're trying to capture. And that's a real skill to learn because, as you'll know from me through these, my job involves a lot of talking. So when I'm recording an interview with somebody, it's very much a case of saying, I am going to sit back and let you talk. So I'll nod my agreement. I'll encourage you to keep speaking. I'll ask you some questions that will kind of move the conversation around. But it's your story, not mine, and I just need to sit here and let you talk. So all of these things are things we need to take into account when we're recording. One of the challenges we always have with oral histories is convincing people that their story matters. And it's the same with trying to get any kind of archival material from people. They don't think that what they have is as important as what other people have. And most people seem to have a built-in feeling that unless they've done something very notable, noteworthy, very interesting or unusual, then they just don't really have anything to give to an archive. They don't really have a story that needs to be saved. But if you think about it, all the things that our parents and grandparents did every single day, let me list some for you. Things like collecting Green Shield stamps, having cars without seatbelts, smoking on aeroplanes, going to the cobblers, wearing hats if you're going to something, having the divvy at the co-op, having rag and bone men coming round the street, sending telegrams, not having supermarkets on hand, going to every single individual shop, as some people of course still do, but going to the butcher and the baker and the greengrocer and not having a supermarket. All of those old pre-health and safety things that people love to talk about, despite all the accidents that came out of them, all of those things are not noteworthy, are not exciting and unusual. They're all everyday things that all of our parents and grandparents will have done. But now, even just a few years later, they're unusual and they're novel. And soon, for a generation or two, they will be utterly fascinating and alien. And it's just capturing those things. I remember when the smoking ban came in, I remember going into restaurants and having to walk through the smoking section to go to the non-smoking section that had no barrier between, so it was utterly pointless having the two sections. All of those things that are in our memories soon will be unimaginable or very alien to the next generation. And that's why it matters to capture them, capture what your everyday is right now. And I mentioned, some of the pitfalls around oral histories, that they can be very subjective, but that's also the wonderful thing about oral histories. The experiences that people have had, their feelings and emotions, and the impact that things have had on them. So we might see, for instance, I talk a lot about the Education Act of 1872. When that came in, it was a huge moment, a huge change, and we've got records that record that. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had 500 recordings of people up and down the country talking about the moment that they had to go to school for the first time because it became law? Or, there will be some stories like that. But if we can capture that, we get a totally different perspective on the big turning points in history. And all of them are part of our collective story. And those things really only appear in things like diaries, letters, and oral histories. And that focus on everyday people and everyday events continues today. And we continue across all bodies and archives and museums that collect oral histories. We continue to try and capture the stories of those who might not appear otherwise in our records, and to allow their stories to survive for the future. And I'll tell you more about some of our current projects at the end. We have many oral history recordings across our collections. You can listen to many of them on Ambala, and I would recommend that you do so. So www.ambaile.org.uk. And it's fantastic to hear them because you can hear people's stories and their own stories in their own words, in their own voices. And I would highly recommend some of the Caithness fisherwomen recordings. They're great stories, fantastic accent. You know that I'm partial to the Caithness accent, but also just some great laughs. There's one lady that I listen to on there, and she just makes me smile. She's talking about her experiences of working in the herring industry, and she sings loads of songs that they would have sung as they were working, and she gets the giggles and she tells jokes, and they're just fantastic. So I really would recommend you have a listen to those. I'm going to tell you about some of the collections that we hold and some of the oral history projects that we're currently working on. In Nucleus, there are 3 specific oral history collections. The first one is the Dounreay collection, and I've spoken about this before in a previous Learn with Lorna. This is a series of recordings captured by Dounreay Heritage Officer James Gunn of workers at Dounreay who came to Caithness and who worked in and around the nuclear facility there. And I won't go into that in much detail because I have spoken about that previously. If you're interested, please do go and have a look back for the Dounreay episode. Another one is Ian Sutherland's collection. This contains over 100 CDs of interviews that Ian conducted with people right across Caithness, hundreds of hours of reminiscences, of memories, of stories, of people just talking about everyday life and things usual and unusual. If you're interested in finding out more about that, the team up at Nucleus recently wrote a blog about Ian Sutherland's collection, and that can be found on the Nucleus website in their Stories from the Archive blog. And another one held in Nucleus in the Caithness Archives is the Caithness Oral History Project, which dates from 1984 to 1987. And again, that seems really recent. That's just a year or two after I was born. But when you look at it, that's already nearly 40 years ago, and things will have changed in that time. And the Caithness Oral History Project was managed by Caithness District Council and was funded by the Manpower Services Commission. And it's a really interesting project because it had a different aim. As well as capturing those stories, the aim of this project was to get the long-term unemployed back into work. And it contains hundreds of audio tapes of interviews recorded with people largely born in the early 1900s. So there was a Thurso-based phase, which was supervised by Colin Binney, which ran from 1984 to 1985. And then there was a Wick-based phase. And the recordings for this project were made in Wick, in Staxigo, Thrumpster, Leibster, Dunbeath, across Caithness. And people were interviewed about herring fishing, farming, home life, the railway, the impact of the war, memories of Wick in the past. And what's lovely about it, as I mentioned, the aim of this was to give the long-term unemployed a route back into work. And so the people who conducted the interviews were trained in interviewing, in using the technology to capture those stories, and then to transcribe them and to digitize and save them. So a really interesting project. And when lovely Val in Wick was pulling together notes on this for me, she selected some recordings of women to draw from, because although, as you'll all know, although we make up around 50% of the population, women's voices have traditionally been less visible in the collections, and oral histories is one of the things that can redress this. And so I wanted to read 4 sections of notes to you that Val has put together. And here's some idea of what those stories contain. So the first is Nellie Mackenzie in Wick. She worked in a laundry and then went into service. Her hours were 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. She says she never got free time. She was scrubbing the kitchen table one day when the mistress asked her to stir the jam she was making, and she dropped the soap into the pan of jam and had given it a couple of stirs before she realised and got it out. Nobody ever commented on the taste, she said. It was very poorly paid, this job, so she got another job working for a doctor, and that was better paid but was very hard work. She went to Larbert mental health nursing and was homesick, so she came home and worked in the laundry again. She got married and her husband was a baker, which was a reserved occupation during the war. She remembers the Bank Row bombing when Wick was bombed in the Second World War. She was working in the laundry at the time and she heard the bombing over the sound of the laundry machines. She had 3 children during the war. She managed all right with the rationing, but the only thing she really hated was powdered egg. It was only when they opened their own shop, the bakery, that they had money at their hand. It was hard work, but they managed to go on a holiday every year and it was a good living. Nellie talks about going to the parochial board when people had no money pre-war. They would get a shilling, which didn't go very far. Doctors would charge for visits half a crown, but most people went to a man called Walter who dispensed medicine because they couldn't afford to go to the doctor. Unmarried mothers got no financial help and they had to go out to work and do everything on their own. They probably had to go to the parochial ward. There was a soup kitchen for the poor on Barrogill Street. Now that's Val condensing that story. Obviously, if you went there to listen to it, you would hear the full detail of that in her own voice. But Val's clipping them together just to give some ideas of the sort of thing that she's talking about. And you can see there the things I was referring to about, she's saying, I assume that unmarried mothers had to go to the parochial board. Well, we know from the parochial board records that some of them did, many of them did. But she's giving that story from her perspective. I assume this is what had to happen. Nancy Roloff, here's a summary of her interview. She went to Keys Primary and then to Wick High School, where she stayed in lodgings during the week and went home at the weekend. She was in Class A, which was the children destined for university. She did a 4-year course at university in social sciences on a scholarship, and she stayed in digs. There were also hostels for girls. She had lots of fun as a student, and she talks particularly about the Rag Week. She graduated in 1929 and got work with the Church of Scotland Social Welfare Committee. Her job was to deal with runaway girls who came to Edinburgh and got into trouble, suicides and marriage breakdowns. She worked in India. She worked in Tyneside during the war. It was a vulnerable area because of the heavy industry in Tyneside, but she escaped the worst of it. Because she had a car, she was expected to take any wounded to hospital. She worked in welfare, assessing servicemen's requests for postings and helping female servicewomen who ran away and war widows who had no income. Her work made her exempt from active service. She then went on to work in social work in London and saw lots of mental health problems, alcoholism, debt, postnatal depression. She came home to Wick in the end, not intending to work, but became secretary for the Wick Society. So you can hear that extraordinary story of all of the things that she's been involved in. You can only imagine all the stories she would have heard in her life. But we've captured it and we've caught, I say we didn't record it, it was recorded in the 1980s, but we as an archive service have got that to treasure, to look after, to preserve and to share for future generations. I like this one of Ruby Doole. She worked in the laundry, but she had to give it up once she had children. And she says, all there was to her life was having bairns and struggling along. And the reason I love that is it's so much the sort of thing that would be so typical of so many people. And she, I would imagine, is the sort of person that would go, well, I don't have anything to say for your interview. All I've had to my life is having bairns and struggling along. And that's why you need to be recorded, because that's your life experience. She had 13 children. When she had William, she was 43 years old and she had to go to the nursing home. Normally a midwife would have just come to the house. When they asked about the war, how did you experience the war? She said, we just had to manage. They got food for the children from a clinic for free tinned food. She fed her bairns from a jumble sale, mending clothes for hours. She had no washing machine, of course. She says she found the wartime very hard, the darkness and the blackouts. She remembered the Bank Row and the Hill Avenue bombings vividly. Her husband was part of liberating Belsen in 1945, and he was given a good reference from the army, as you would hope after being at Belsen. So yes, stories there of people doing extraordinary things, people doing ordinary things. And the last one I wanted to share with you from the Nucleus collections is the story of Baba Mackay in Wick. In her interview, she spoke about the changes in the town that had happened over her lifetime, the amount of shops on residential streets. So there used to be 3 or 4 shops on every street. Holidays in her lifetime were a day out to Leicester on the train or to Thurso on the bus. The cinema was once a week on a Friday night. At home, they listened to the wireless and then the TV from 1957. All the bairns' clothes were handmade. Everything was hand-knitted. She remembers the Bank Row bombing. She was on her way to the butcher's, but she could go no further when the bomb was dropped. When the Hill Avenue bombing took place, she had to take cover in a shop cellar. She used to deliver lunch to her granny while she worked at gutting herring at Wick Harbour. Her mum would make tea in an enamel pail with a lid and sandwiches. The children had to hold the sandwiches for their granny so that she could bite them, as her hands were dirty and she couldn't take the binding off her fingers until her shift was finished. And I've spoken before about that, wearing the binding to protect their fingers from the knives when they were gutting the herring. But it's such a vivid picture that captures, that conjures up of the children holding the sandwich for their granny so she could eat it. It's a story that you wouldn't get in official records. Her grandfather was a cooper, and when things were quiet and he had no work, there was no welfare payment. Her granny was very generous and would often give food away even to them who had even less, to those who had even less than they did. Her husband would complain that they now had nothing to eat, and she would say, we'll get something, wait and you see, David. And someone would always come to the door with a couple of kippers. The girls would all get a dress for Christmas, and they would wear it to a Christmas party and the school annual, and maybe they would get some sweets. Her wedding, she describes getting married during wartime in 1942. No party, no photographs, got married and came straight home afterwards. Couldn't get a wedding dress, just an ordinary dress and a coat that she wore for years afterwards. They had a camera, but you couldn't get any spools for them at that time. You couldn't get a pram during wartime because they weren't being made. Utility prams came out, but there was such a waiting list that she couldn't get one. And she goes on to describe rationing and saving sugar for the baby's bottle. Again, just real insights into real people's lives. They are fantastic series of recordings. And in our Skyloch Elsh archives, we also hold a number of recordings, and that oral tradition of storytelling and passing down song and reminiscence and collective community memory is, of course, still very strong on the West Coast and in the islands. And Catherine sent me some various transcripts from some interviews that they had in their collections, and I wanted to share with you one from the Ambata Oral History Project from 2011-2012, and the recording of Donald John McMillan. And in his interview for the Ambata Project, which is about boats, I believe, I'm sure that is the exact translation, is to do with living and existing in and around boats. He was speaking about his grandfather, who was Rory McMillan, who was a boat builder in Letterfern, and also about another boat builder, Finlay Chisholm. So he's saying here, they started off with the ads, that's it over there, because they recorded in the garage. That's the ads. So they used them for cutting the keel, and they did that, and that's one of them over there. That one was lying in the shed when I took it over, and there were planes in the shed as well. So he's describing all the tools that his grandfather used to make the boats. He was a huge, powerful man. I've seen other photographs of him in the house, but he was just a big, massive lump of a man. So he must have died when you were pretty young then, the interviewer says to him. He died in 1940. Now, let's see now. Must have been about 44, but he was dead before my mother died. Yes, he was. Yeah, I think he died in 1944 or early 45. And the interviewer says, do you remember him? Oh, I remember him. I remember visiting the house, and I remember him coming up on the boat. There's a photograph of him in one of the boats that he built. I took it out for you. There's it there. That's one of his boats. And he built quite a number of boats, I believe. He had a great idea. He brought up an engine from Glasgow, and he was going to put in it in a launch he'd made. I don't know if that ever happened, though, because the engine was there for years. That's Rory, he says, pointing out a photo. And that's one of the other things we try to do, is when things like that are talked about, to try and capture the image of the photo to put with the recording. And he says, there's a lovely story about him which you don't need to record, but it seems that he was busy planing away as usual, doing some planking or something, and he was busy like this, and the Jehovah's Witnesses arrived. And they said to him, well, my man, have you found God? And he just carried on and said, I didn't know I'd lost him. And he carried on planing, and somebody told the local minister, and that was used in sermons all over the place. It went off to the head of the Church of Scotland in Edinburgh or something. People used that story for ages as a thing, the Highlander who didn't know he'd lost God, so they asked him if he'd found him. But I remember him. See, now this is a bit strange, this one. I thought he'd died before my mother died, but now I'm not so sure, because we had an aunt that took us down there. That would have been from Rattigan, so we were still there then. You see, my mother died in 1946, about a year after Sarah was born. That's his sister. I think he died a year before that. I should have it somewhere recorded. But anyway, an aunt who was with us took us down to Letterfern for the weekend to stay at her friend's house. So we were along visiting Rory, and that's a clear picture I have of Rory, my grandfather. I remember him another time coming to Letterfern, and my mother couldn't have been well because he rowed up to see her. That was his means of transport. He rowed his boat up, probably that boat in that photo, or another one that he made. But anyway, he was rowed up, and my father was mad at him and wanted to get a lift home, but he wasn't having any of it. I think my father had to go down with him in the end and row him back down because he was a bit tired. Because he was an old man then. He was in his 70s, says he. And it goes on, he describes seeing him making tea over an open fire. He says he was a very, very powerful man. There were stories of him carrying this huge larch trunk of a tree out the wood, and that he'd carried it all the way, this whole tree trunk all the way through the woods. So again, you can see exactly what I mean there about the things when he's talking there about the grandfather's date of death. So it could have been then, or it could have been then. Now, was it before that happened or after that happened? Now, we can easily get that information because we can look up a death certificate and get that fact. But as he's doing, as we all do, which is placing it in his own story. So when did he die? Was that before that happened or after that happened? Because all of those things are linked in his life experience and his story. So you can see how valuable those recordings are, but also how quickly the lifestyles become less common and more distant. So that was recorded, as I say, in 2011-12. He's talking about his grandfather who died in the 1940s. So he's talking pre that, and that his grandfather's making the tea over the open fire on a kettle hanging on a piece of metal or wood over the fire, metal presumably. Talking about carrying those trees through woods, talking about taking his boat to go everywhere. Now, of course, some people will still do those things, but it becomes less common, and it's important that we can capture those things before it disappears. We have numerous oral history recordings across the Highland Archives collections, and we're continuing to add to them. We're trying to capture and preserve everyday lives and experiences of people who are connected with the Highlands and Islands, particularly when those stories are at risk of being lost. So, for instance, we have been doing and continue to do a project capturing the stories of elderly people who lived through the Second World War in the Highlands, because we know that those stories are at risk of being lost or forgotten. We're also working on projects to capture the stories of people who aren't represented in our collections. So, for instance, we're working on a project at the moment with the LGBT community where we're trying to record interviews with people who are gay, who are transgender, who have had any gender identity issues connected to the Highlands and Islands. How can we record conversations to make sure that those people are represented in our collections going forward? I'm also working at the moment on a project where we're recording some stories of refugees who have come to the Highlands and Islands, whether that's from Afghanistan, from Syria, from different places, people who have come in to make this their home. How do we capture that experience so that it's there, and so that when we look back in the future, it's a broader picture of who is here? It's been a real privilege of mine in the last few days to start capturing recordings for the LGBT community, and I will be doing the refugee recordings in the end of October, beginning of November. And it's a real privilege for me to hear those stories. And while I dislike labeling people, I dislike making people a refugee community or an LGBT community, but what I do want is to capture the stories of those people who have come to be part of our society in whatever route. And we'll continue to seek to do this for different communities and different individuals going forward. But I wanted to close just by telling you a little bit about an event that Catherine and Anne in Skye and Lochaelch recently ran with local folklorist, an oral historian and all-round lovely person, Margaret Bennett. They hosted an afternoon workshop demonstrating how memories and photos and conversation and laughter can all add to and deepen the community's understanding of itself and its past. It started as an in-person event and went on to be an online evening ceilidh where people could join in and share memories and conversations. And the oral history recordings for that project continued through COVID, being recorded online instead of in person. They not only broaden our collections and enable future generations to learn about today, but they often made a real difference to the interviewee as well. A feeling of company, of value, of pride in the fact that their story was going to survive beyond them for others to hear and to learn from. If you're interested in this subject particularly, then I would like to point you towards a few different places. For information about the subject itself and best practice, then the Oral History Society's website is a very, very useful resource. There are others as well, but that's a good starting place. If you're interested in hearing some oral histories and looking at some collections, Colourful Heritage is one of my favourite projects. This is looking at the story of Glaswegians, South Asians who've come to be part of the Glasgow community. Fantastic project. Whenever I hear them, the organisers speak about it, there's such a passion that comes across and such a respect for the journeys that people took to make Glasgow their home, and how the young people in that community today can learn from them and learn the lessons to apply to their own lives. Our Story Scotland is the national collection of LGBT oral histories for Scotland. Tober and Dulchas, which is collects Scottish cultural heritage oral recordings. The Scottish Council on Archives is running a project called Voices. One was focusing on the Hebridean stories of people in the Hebrides during COVID, and the next one is looking at people who have moved in and around Scotland, and that's the recordings I'm doing with Syrian and Afghan refugees and ladies and gentlemen who've come from those countries as part of that project. And also, of course, our own website, Ambala, has numerous recordings for you to have a listen to. It's a fantastic subject. It is interesting and powerful and useful and important to capture people in their own words, in their own voices, and to be caught before those stories disappear. Thank you for joining me for this subject, for this Learn with Lorna. I'll see you next week when we'll be looking at the subject of place names, and a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.